So today we're going to be talking about growing green peppers, hot peppers, all kinds of peppers. Peppers are in the tomato family, and it's in the nightshade family. So it's very similar to growing tomatoes. There's a lot of overlap, but a few key differences that we're going to go over and talk about. So, like I said, I like to plant my peppers in March. So there's a couple of different techniques that we can use to plant our peppers. Like here are pictured in the slide, we have a bunch of cells that each have one pepper growing in the center of the cell, but that takes up a lot of room. And like right now it's not so bad, but later on in the spring we're going to have a lot more plants, and it's going to take up a lot of room. So I like to save space, and sometimes I'll plant multiple pepper plants in the same pot and let them mature. And as they get bigger and we want to start dividing them up, you can take them out of the pot, divide them up. Be very delicate with the roots, not to damage too many of the roots. But that's one way that you can save quite a bit of space. They can grow reasonably big, a good 3 or 4 inches tall, like that. If they're planted on the outer edge of your pot, like on the top right hand corner photograph, it's easier to do. On the bottom left, they're a little bit more crowded and it's a little bit more challenging. So I do both my peppers and my tomatoes this way. My tomatoes, I don't mind if they get leggy in the pot, and we'll talk about that in another session for down the road when we start our tomato plants. Basically, a tall leggy tomato plant will root all along its stem. So if it has a tall, scraggly stem, that's just root zone to me. So when I divide them out of the pot like that, I'll bury them. I'll take out any bottom leaves off, and I'll plant I'll plant it really, really deep. I'll bury the entire stem and just leave just the very top few leaves sticking out of the ground. And that way it creates a much larger, much stronger root zone and a more solid tomato plant. But a pepper can't do that. So we have to handle the pepper plant a little bit differently than we do the tomato. Now, peppers they need some warmth to germinate. So I planted my peppers and I had them in my basement under lights and stuff like that, but it was cool, it was chilly. So I moved them upstairs right behind me over here where this room is heated. They weren't germinating very well. So as soon as I brought them up here, it's a warm room, a little warmer than comfortable sometimes. But peppers like a temperature of somewhere between 27 and 32 degrees Celsius before they'll germinate. So oftentimes folks will have a hard time getting them to germinate, and that's why. If it's too cold, too cold, the peppers won't germinate, and sometimes they might even rot in the pot if it stays too chilly for too long. And then basically you have to start over. So warmth is very important. Some folks put down one of those heating trays underneath your seed tray. That's a really good idea. You can set your temperature and you have a stable temperature for your pepper seeds to germinate, and you'll have a really good turnout, very good germination. Now, one of the reasons I like to plant my peppers a little bit earlier is because I like to prune my peppers before I put them out into the garden. Now, what you want to do to prune your peppers is as soon as it's got 4 real full leaves, but before it starts to produce flowers, you want to prune your little growing tip after it's got 4 full nice big size leaves. So the tiny little leaves that are just starting to open up, leaf number 5 and 6 there, when they start to open up there, you can just pinch those off with your thumb and finger like that and just take it off. And what happens there is you give your plant a more shorter stem, a more solid stem, and you'll force it to produce more branches. And each of these branches at the 4 leaves, where the leaf node attaches to the stem, it'll produce a new branch there. So by trimming the growing tip, it'll force new branches to grow there. So you have 4 branches that will all of them are going to produce more fruit. So it gives you a shorter, more stable, more solid plant that can handle the kinds of winds that we experience here on the East Coast, right? So in this video here, these plants were a little bit taller, and they were kind of flimsy and floppity, and then they were being bent over by the wind, and they already had some flowers growing on them while they were in the pot. They had been grown in a greenhouse, and they were a little bit more mature than they needed to be in order to be brought outside. And by pruning that plant there, I would kind of set it back a couple of weeks. So we kind of lost a couple of weeks of productivity because it wasted time growing those flowers. So if you don't have to prune your pepper, but if you do, you'll have a shorter, more stocky plant that's more resilient. Peppers are quite heavy once they start producing, like green peppers and those big bell peppers. And a plant can only produce about 4 to 7 peppers. You need to plant a lot of peppers in order to get enough for your needs. If you're planting jalapenos or other smaller hot peppers, they can produce dozens and dozens of peppers on the same plant, and you don't really need to prune those. They'll typically grow pretty thick branches, and they can hold a lot of fruit. But the large bell peppers, you have to be concerned with the structural integrity of the plant. Can it hold 7 big bell peppers on it? One of the problems that I find especially in my garden here, I grow in heavy clay soil, as many people here growing in this climate zone. Our soil here is either sand or it's heavy clay. Sometimes we're lucky and we have a little bit of some loamy soil, but for the most part there we have to choose between the 2 problematic growing spaces. And clay soil has a tendency to hold slugs. And when the pepper leans over and touches the ground, a slug has a tendency to get on there. It'll eat a hole into your pepper, climb in, and make a home inside your pepper and ruin it. And it's very, very, very difficult to control for that. So that's why, in order to get better results in my garden, I like to prune them. That's why I start them a month earlier, so that setting them back a couple of weeks isn't going to be a problem when it comes to getting my harvest over the summer months. So like I said, peppers, you have to plant a lot of them in order for them to grow enough fruit for it to be worth your while. Growing 1 or 2 pepper plants is only going to give you a few fruit. So if you want to make preserves, you have to produce that many more. Oftentimes, like for our needs, I like to harvest them and dehydrate them, and we'll talk about that later. So that I have enough through the winter months. So I'll plant around 150 pepper plants. There might be a couple of different varieties in there, just to have differences in color and flavor and that kind of thing. But basically, peppers are very friendly plants. So if you want to do some companion planting, and what the best companion to a pepper plant is another pepper plant. They like to hold hands. So basically, you want to plant them close enough together that the tips of the leaves on a mature plant are going to intermingle with one another. That enhances pollination, and for one reason or another, they just grow more vigorously when you do that, and it gives you so much better results than a pepper plant that's growing by itself. It'll be productive, but when they grow in a group, it's like it's got an energy boost. It's like it's a party and they're having a great time, and they'll give you peppers and reward you for that. So for me, I like to plant them in a zigzag grid pattern. Now, depending on the size of your pepper, it'll tell you on the seeds what your spacing should be. Some plants are bigger than others. So your bell peppers tend to be a larger plant than your jalapenos. But basically, You look at like a zigzag, or if you want to imagine it on a larger scale, a number 5 on a dice. So your 4 corners and 1 in the middle. It's got all even spacing all around. It's got the same amount of spacing between the rows. But this is the pattern that you can stack more things that want to be round at the closest possible. It's the same geometry as a honeycomb. And so it's basically bubbles. If all the bubbles are in the same size, they sit in a pattern like that. And that gives you the most efficient surface area for growing your different vegetables. Peppers can be planted like this, onions, all kinds of vegetables can be planted like this. Corn, I often will lay out my corn like that in my garden bed. It's typically my garden beds are 30 to 36 inch wide rows. They're 50 to 70 feet long, and so basically I like to pack everything in there right nice and tight. So sometimes, like pictured on the photograph right here, where I have a very unfortunate facial expression, I like to use sometimes, if the garden bed is a little bit weedy, I like to put down a weed barrier, a long narrow tarp that covers the whole garden bed. And we'll take a soup can, heat it up with a blowtorch, and just sit it and burn holes. It'll burn you a circular hole into your plastic tarp or weed barrier, and that allows you your spacing for your plant. You can just pop your seedling in there, and in the spaces around are covered by a tarp, so there's not going to be any weeding issues going on there. Plus, it gives you a little bit of heat especially when we have some colder temperatures in each end of your growing season. The dark tarp, it has an albedo effect, so it increases its temperature. Black objects absorb heat, white objects or pale objects reflect heat, so it'll give you a little bit more heat. Now, too much heat, it could be a problem, and we'll look at that in a minute, but basically this is for me just to save time, because like most folks, I've got a busy schedule outside of my garden. I have a life outside of that, so I don't want to spend too much my time weeding in my garden. So this is a solution that I found to reduce the amount of labor I need to put into my garden every week. I try to limit my time in the garden to around 5 to 6 hours at the most. And I prefer that most of that time is spent harvesting. So this is the same garden later on in the season. So as you see, as they fill out, they kind of cover your plastic tarp. All the leaves kind of touch one another, and they really fill up that space. So like I said, it only produces 4 to 7 fruits at a time. So you have to sow a reasonable amount of plants in order to produce your the amount of peppers that you'd like to get. Now, if you're lucky, sometimes you can have 2, sometimes 3 harvests per year on the same plant. And the best thing to do there is to pick it while it's still green. So by picking your pepper while it's green, you can still get it to mature and turn red or orange or yellow, whatever color pepper you got. You can get it to mature in the house like you would with tomatoes. You can put them in a cardboard box with a ripe banana in there. A ripe banana or any ripe fruit will exude ethylene gas. It's part of the biology of a ripe fruit, and that stimulates neighboring fruits to ripen as well. So if you put it in a cardboard box with a ripe tomato or a ripe banana, and cover it with a little towel, a dish towel or something like that, just to keep the fruit flies off and just to keep the gas concentrated in the area, you'll see a change of color. Now, I've noticed for myself that sometimes I'll lose some of the peppers will rot, especially those who were affected by slugs, because the slugs are still inside the pepper doing their thing and ruining it, and so it'll go bad in that kind of thing like that. But you still get the majority of your fruit. So if you pay attention to it and you keep an eye on it and you process and dehydrate your ripe peppers as you go, you'll lose less, right? So peppers, for fertilizing a pepper, I prefer to use all natural materials to fertilize my garden. I use compost. I use compost tea. I'll make vermicompost, and I'll use that as an amendment. But if you do use fertilizer, you want to pay attention to how much nitrogen you're giving your pepper. When you first plant your pepper, it's good to give it some nitrogen to help it produce leaves. That's what nitrogen does. Nitrogen produces leaves. Phosphorus and potassium helps more with the roots and the fruiting. But at first, when you first plant it in, you want it to grow some leaves and get established. Once it's got some new leaves, some new branches, and it's looking green and lush, and it's about ready to start flowering, it's good to pull back on that nitrogen. So for me, as an organic gardener, instead of using, for the fertilizer pellets or powders or anything like that out of a bag, I typically will enrich my garden bed with compost. I'll give it a 2 to 3 inch. If I have 3 inches, I'll give it 3 inches of compost every spring. Usually around the time that I plant, I'll put it in there. So at home, I don't do tilling. It's all no-till or minimal till, I should say. And so I prefer to not disturb the soil as much as possible so that I can enhance more soil structure and encourage soil biology. And then I let the biology take care of my pepper plant. I've found that in those years where we used to fertilize with chemical fertilizers, we had to pay attention of, okay, well, this week we'll give it some nitrogen, and next week we'll give it some nitrogen, the week after. But then there's a point where you have to stop. But using compost, it's not so much of a problem. So when you decide that it's time to stop producing leaves and you want it to start producing fruit, you have to cut off that nitrogen and replace it with Epsom salt. So that's where oftentimes I'll take a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons of Epsom salt in my jug of my watering can and fill it up with water, let it dissolve, and then I'll water. You can water the leaves. You can water I prefer to water just the roots. And Epsom salt, the non-perfumed Epsom salt would be better. It's magnesium sulfate, so it's magnesium and it's a sulfur compound. So these are things that help the plant to flower, and so it'll help stimulate that bloom and start producing your fruit. If you continue to give it nitrogen, it'll produce leaves, it'll get big, it'll get a big bushy plant, but won't be producing fruit. Where peppers were originally innovated is in Peru by the First Nations people of Peru, and but over there, peppers grow almost like a perennial. It's basically it's almost a woody plant. It's like a soft woody plant, and it grows year after year. So that's what it's trying to do in your garden, but our season just isn't up to that task. Now, if you want to save yourself a little bit of effort, you can take your pepper plant out of your garden at the end of the season, put it back into a pot, and bring it into your house under some lights, and continue to grow more peppers. Cayenne pepper and smaller peppers like that do really well like this. You can also bring in your big bell peppers and all that other stuff. They might not produce fruit in the middle of winter, but your cayenne pepper can, your jalapenos and your hot peppers. If you're courageous enough to grow a Carolina Reaper, I'm a little scared of growing a Carolina Reaper. I'm not very big on the spice, but you can get those to produce some fruit a little bit during the winter months. I've produced cayenne and harvested in January before. So in the winter months when we're kind of down and a little, there's not much going on in the garden, it's actually a real boost to your morale. you know, while there's snowstorms outside, you're harvesting fresh peppers out of your, you know, potted pepper plants. Now, peppers need heat to germinate, and they like heat, but not too much of it. Oftentimes, I get comments and questions about, you know, well, it's mid-season and I'm not getting any peppers and the flowers keep falling off. So flower drop is a stress response on the part of the pepper plant. I like to give dappled shade to my pepper plant. So basically on the south side of my pepper plants, I like to put like a snow fence or something like that. It has like little holes in it like that, as you see in the photograph on your left. The left side there where that fence is, that's the south side of that garden bed. So that gives good dappled shade during the lunch hour, you know, the noon, 1, 2 o'clock, and even into 3 o'clock, at the hottest times of the day. It's got dappled shade. It's still got enough light to photosynthesize, but it's not as hot, not as warm. So anything above 24 degrees Celsius could be very stressful for your pepper plant. So that dappled shade can keep, you know, a 30-degree weather day. In the shade, you might be close to that 22, 23, 24 degrees Celsius. So not reaching those 30 degrees, 31, 32 degrees Celsius that our summers have been producing lately. So this is not a problem that we've had all that much in the past, but in the last decade, we noticed that our summers can be quite hot. And so this is one of the tricks that I've used to prevent blossom drop on pepper plants. And as you see here, these are basically, it's just plastic tarp with holes in it to prevent weeds. This was a weedy garden bed in the spring. I hadn't put a tarp on it in the fall. So in order to prevent you know, a lot of labor weeding that garden bed, just cover the weeds up, leave the tarp on there in the spring a week or two before you plant out your pepper plants. Dig some holes, just burn some holes with a hot can. And just plant your seedlings in there. And, you know, it produces a very clean, very easy to manage garden bed. So late July and August there, that's when you really need. Like at the end of August, getting into September, it's not so much of a problem anymore. But I leave my fence there anyways, because I raise geese and chickens, and I need to keep those buggers out of my garden during the productive months, because otherwise I don't get a garden. So harvest your peppers while they're still green. And that way, especially your larger your bell peppers or other peppers, these peppers here, the green ones you see, are Carmen peppers. They produce a very lovely red pepper, but I pick them green, bring them in the house like I mentioned earlier. Let them mature there. Sometimes I'll process them and dehydrate them while they're greens. The red ones, I'll dehydrate them separate so that I have some red peppers to add to different dishes and stuff like that. But it takes about as much time to ripen a pepper on the plant as it does to produce a pepper on the plant. So if you want a red pepper on your plant, you're going to be sacrificing its productive capacity. So by harvesting your peppers early while they're still green, just as they get a good size, start pulling them off and bring them in the house and processing them. And that way it'll have the energy to start producing more flowers and more fruit and give you a second crop. So oftentimes I'll harvest like this in the beginning of August, and by September I'll have a second harvest. And if I'm lucky and we have a late winter and I cover them in the fall with frost blankets, protect them from frost, I might get a third harvest. Sometimes they're not as thick, they're not as big peppers, but there's still a few small peppers on each plant. When you have 150 plants or 200 plants, it's still worth doing. And so that's one of the ways that I try to maximize the productive output of these plants. You can produce ripened plants or ripened fruit on the vine. You can produce them on the vine in a greenhouse if you have a greenhouse. I'm assuming not everybody's got the best top of the line, everything like the most amazing commercial equipment in their backyard. I'm figuring most of us here are regular folks with a backyard garden who just want to supplement their grocery budget or kind of knocking down their grocery budget a little bit with their garden. That's basically how I got into gardening, trying to save some money, growing my own food. And but if you can set up a greenhouse, it's a great way to extend the season and get some vine ripened peppers. In our climate zone, it's not going to be as good as you can get out of California or Mexico or some of those other places that have a warmer, longer season climate than we have here. So see, these are some of the workarounds that I've come up with through it's a little bit of research online and trial and error. So dehydration, I find, is one of the best ways to preserve peppers. I've been recommended to just chop them up and put them and freeze them and put them to freeze, and that gives you kind of a mushy kind of pepper result, which is all right too if you're using it in the dish, like if you're making a spaghetti sauce or if you're making a stew or something. They're great to add in there, but I find they dehydrate really well, and they stay very stable over a very long period of time. So when they're dehydrated, I like to put them in a mason jar, nice and tight lid. It doesn't have to be vacuum sealed, but it could be. There are attachments for a vacuum sealer that you can attach to your mason jar and pull the air out, and that way it'll stay stable for years. Typically, I'll run out of these before I get my next harvest. I still haven't pegged the number of peppers I need in order to produce enough to be completely self-sustaining in peppers year-round. We eat a lot of them. I really like peppers, and we use a lot of dishes with this stuff. So here are some jalapenos, and they're not overly hot, but there's this is one of the harvests that we've had from I think this one was this was last year's harvest, and no, this is 2 years ago. Yeah, this is 2022 harvest. So it stays very stable. It reconstitutes really well. Just put it in some boiling water. Let it sit for a little bit. It picks up a lot of the, it fluffs up nice, reasonably nice. The great benefits of dehydrating vegetables of all kinds is that it concentrates the flavors. So when you use these, you don't need to use as much as you would a fresh pepper, but it really packs a punch. It really gives you that deep, flavorful pepper flavor. It will lose its pepper crunch though. It's not the same as a fresh pepper. If you wanted it in a salad, for instance, it'll be mushy, but have a very similar texture to cooked pepper, and the flavor is really there. It's a really good flavor.